Good afternoon and welcome to At Yale Live. I'm Eric Gershon. The 2012 elections are over and Americans have returned the sitting president to the White House. The balance of power in Congress remains little changed. Republicans keep control of the House of Representatives. Democrats keep control of the Senate. So how will America change? What does the near future of the United States look like? What are the issues we can expect our leaders to address and how? Three Yale scholars join us today to offer their thoughts on the election's likely consequences for near-term public policy. Jacob Hacker, political scientist and director of Yale's Institution for Social and Policy Studies. Beverly Gage, historian of the U.S. political ideology and institutions. And from the Yale School of Management, David Bach, who studies and teaches about financial market regulation and global business. We are delighted to have you all here.
Thank you for having us.
So let's jump right in. We've got the president back in the White House. We've got a Congress that's roughly balanced about the same. How has the environment for governance changed?
Well, as you described it, right, it hasn't changed in a fundamental way. The House Republicans have lost a few of their ranks, but it's still a very conservative caucus. And so the real question is, how will Republicans respond to the election results? Leading up to the election, the central issue was this question of what we were going to do to deal with the expiring Bush tax cuts and a bunch of spending cuts that are scheduled to go into effect and now are being called the fiscal cliff. And that's going to be the first order of business of Congress, is dealing with that. In fact, it'll be the lame duck session. It won't be the newly elected members. And if you look at the statements that are coming out of the White House and the Republican caucus, John Boehner, I think it's right now there maybe is a little bit of a sign toward conciliation on the part of the House. There's a bit more mojo on the part of the president, but it sounds like we're back at the same fundamental issue, which has to do with to what extent are revenues, not letting these tax cuts expire be a big part of the package. And my own view is that the Democrats are probably going to have to go pretty far to push the Republican caucus. There isn't a real sign yet that Republicans read this election as being a kind of repudiation of more fundamental aspects of their governing philosophy. There's a sense that they're at a strategic disadvantage in this fight, but I still think it's going to be a really fierce battle. And we are, probably happy to forget that the debt ceiling is actually an issue. That right now everyone's focused on the fiscal cliff, but soon the debt ceiling will be reached again, and we'll have the same fight, same kind of fight that we had in 2011. So I think that's the way to understand it. What is going to be the strategic response of Republicans to the election results? Because the basic balance of power hasn't really changed.
So you said the Democrats are going to have to go pretty far. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, the way people are talking about now is go over the cliff, which makes it sound like it's all going to happen on one day. The big aspect of the cliff that people talk about is the expiring tax cuts. And so that will happen at the beginning of the new year. And there is a broad sense among Democrats, particularly more liberal Democrats, that to get the Republicans to sign on to serious revenue increases, which would mean letting the Bush tax cuts expire for the richest 2% of Americans for income levels above $250,000, at least substantially raising those rates, maybe not going back to the Clinton-era rates. For that to happen, you're going to have to go over the cliff. You're going to have to actually see the tax increases for that for all Americans go into effect. That is, to have all of the Bush tax expire, including those for the middle class. Now, because the Treasury Department, because of tax day isn't until April 15th, and because there's withholding, but the Treasury Department has some latitude. This may actually be more symbolic than real, and so the question is, how will the stock market respond? How will the commentators respond? But Republicans feel as if that they are likely to take a substantial share of the blame if this happens, and so Democrats are thinking if they push over the cliff, that they're likely to be in a stronger bargaining position. I just mentioned one other thing, which I think is really, crucial to understand in this debate, and that is that Republicans are not just worried about Democrats. They're worried about their own political base. The biggest concern up till now has been Grover Norquist and his anti-tax pledge, and Norquist has made clear that while you could rejigger the tax code in ways that might raise revenues without violating his no new taxes pledge, that actually raising the top tax brackets counts as a tax increase. Now, some Republicans and Democrats say, well, if we go over the cliff, then all of a sudden, all bets are off. But Norquist is not a dumb guy, right? He knows that's what they, he knows that counts as allowing tax rates to go up for the top. And so, does Norquist have the kind of sway he did before? It didn't. The folks who signed the pledge, the new candidates who signed the pledge, did not do particularly well. There's a sense that there has to be some serious adjustments in the budget, and that the kind of dogmatic position that Norquist has isn't as viable as it used to be. But people have bet against this kind of hardline stance before and lost, and Republicans are pretty well protected in the House. They've been reelected at very high rates. They have, while the money that was in the election didn't seem to make a big difference at the aggregate level, it did help shield Republican incumbents, and so there may be a sense within the Republican caucus they can wait the storm out, and that while they'll have to accept some increase in revenues, and much of it coming from the wealthiest of Americans, so they wouldn't have to go all the way.
So does the president's re-election improve his negotiating position with respect to this issue at all, in the view of any of you?
Well, I'd say that actually is one place where things have changed. So not simply the fact that Obama was reelected, which obviously puts him in a slightly different position in terms of not needing to then run for reelection one more time. But I think one of the big questions that was on the table here was what kind of public narrative we were going to have about the Obama presidency. And that was one of the things that was being decided here. When Barack Obama was elected, there was a lot of talk that we were entering kind of a shift in the ideological cycles of American politics and in the kind of cycles of party dominance in American politics, which is to say that roughly from Franklin Roosevelt through to Ronald Reagan, we had a period that was roughly characterized as being really dominated by the Democratic Party, dominated by kind of liberal ideas. With the rise of Ronald Reagan and then through the Bush presidencies, we had a period that's really dominated by more conservative ideas, dominated by the Republican Party structurally. And one of the big questions was, so did the election of Barack Obama signal some kind of emerging shift, both ideologically and in terms of party coalitions, and in terms of who was going to be really pushing and who was going to be reacting for the future. And I think had he not been reelected, we would have seen a story emerge that there was a moment of crisis, something weird happened, which is that we elected the first African-American president, we elected a Democrat, but things went back to the way that they were before. And the fact that he's been reelected, I think, really fundamentally changes that narrative and makes much bigger questions possible now about the ways in which big ideas are shifting. It makes things possible for Obama himself. Again, not only the fact that he's not going to have to run for re-election, but the fact that he has been kind of affirmed in a different way. He's not just a president who kind of came to power in a moment of crisis now, right? He is someone whose policies and ideas have been affirmed in what was certainly a close election, and I think in many ways a much closer election than the public narrative at the moment is actually suggesting that it was. Certainly in historical terms, this was a very close election, and maybe that's something that we want to talk about a little bit. But I do think he's gained the ability to kind of capitalize on and create his own narrative now in ways that were less possible at earlier moments.
And I would just say to follow on that I think that there was a lot of criticism that the president really didn't have a very ambitious forward-looking agenda. But that vice perhaps could be a virtue when it comes to this issue, because he did talk a lot about how the one thing he wasn't going to let happen was to let us go forward and extend tax cuts for rich people who, like him, he keeps saying, who don't need it. So in that sense, I think there are very few mandates you can read, and I'm generally skeptical about reading mandates into election results, period, but there's very few mandates you can read into this election, I think. But this is one of them, right? And the president clearly thinks that he has the upper hand on this issue.
He said exactly that yesterday at the press conference, that, look, I mean, the one thing that I've been saying consistently is exactly that. And I think you're right. I mean, it isn't just that he was reelected, but it was also how he was reelected. The fact that the coalition held up, that there was a governing coalition that perhaps we haven't seen in the past before about minorities, about women, about young people, about urban voters. And if you look at the demographics, you look at the exit polls, a lot of these people agree that some of the wealthiest need to pay more. The interesting thing, of course, with the cliff is, and I think you're absolutely right, Jacob, about it doesn't kick in right away. Well, on January 1st, once we've gone over it, Republicans and Democrats can come together and put in place a tax cut for 98% of Americans. That's a pretty popular thing to do. Now, Grover Norquist can say, well, you raised them for 2%. Well, nobody raised anything. That decision was taken more than a year ago. It just now happens, and then we all come together, declare victory for cutting taxes for 98%.
Well, that's a very positive view. But it does remind me that back when the Bush tax cuts were enacted, there were sort of Democratic and liberal wags who were saying that Bush not only passed one of the largest tax cuts in American history, but also one of the largest tax hikes. And we should, because of course these were all set to expire and they've been extended now in 2 separate periods. And we should remember that the reason that they were not put in place permanently was because of the budget rules, and they were not willing to, if they had been willing to specify ways to pay for them indefinitely, then of course they would be able to stay on the books. So this has been an ongoing issue. For Republicans, it was really playing to their advantage. Every time this came up, they said, look, we're going to have this massive tax increase, and strategically it seemed as if it was really working to their advantage. I think again, with a kind of modest, targeted approach, the administration has put the Republicans in actually a pretty difficult strategic position. They came in saying, we're going to let all of these tax cuts continue except for this small portion, which turns out to be a pretty big chunk of money, but a small share of the population, the $800 billion over 10 years that goes to the top 2%. And with the economy weak and with the president's position, frankly, weak after the 2010 midterms, they weren't able to get it. Now I think they feel pretty confident they can get something substantial, or if not, returning to the Clinton-era tax rates for the top, at least having some movement in that direction, plus some kinds of tax reform, capping tax deductions that will raise money as well.
Right. Given the urgency and the deadline for dealing with the fiscal cliff, it's taking up a lot of space in the print media and the broadcast media. It's on everybody's mind.
Well, whatever is left over from the Petraeus scandal, right?
Right.
That's the story.
Exactly.
Right.
The fact that we're going over the cliff, that it's 4% of GDP, comes second.
As far as the media is concerned, this is great because they've been coming up with ways to dramatize the fiscal cliff. It's like Selma and Louise style, showing big pictures of cliffs and, the fear that we should all be feeling about this. But frankly, their heart's not really in it, right? It's a policy issue. Most of the cable news is just not interested in it. All of a sudden, sex scandal. It's just happy days are here again. So.
We'll just be thankful it's not the Grover Norquist sex scandal, which would really take us over the cliff.
So one theme, obviously, that we heard a lot about in the campaign, certainly from Mitt Romney, was about jobs and employment. And we've got roughly 8% national unemployment still now, and GDP is not really growing all that fast. So it seems like once the panic, for lack of a better term, over the fiscal cliff subsides somewhat, jobs are likely to reemerge as a front burner issue. And so I wonder if any of you have thoughts on meaningful actions that government can take, and that the president, to the extent that the president can actually influence the economy, should or could take.
Well, I think the good news for Obama is that, in fact, right, things are, when we stand back in 30 years and look at his presidency, there's a very, very good likelihood that compared to the moment that he came into office, the place that we're going to end up in 2016 is going to be much, much better, and probably better than where we are now. I mean, of course, there are precedents, like, for instance, the 1937 election in which Franklin Roosevelt, was he the last Democrat to be reelected with a majority? I believe people are playing around with all of these kind of historical comparisons at the moment. But he's elected in an overwhelming landslide that we haven't seen the likes of in a long, long time in American politics, and of course immediately hits a new recession. And I don't think that there's a lot of expectation about that, though that is of course one of the concerns as we talk about the fiscal cliff here. But the likelihood is that in terms of his presidency, whatever he does, things are going to look better by the time he's leaving office than they did when he started.
I would only say whatever he does within some broad
right.
parameters.
I mean, he could really screw it up. It is absolutely
and they understand that. I mean, the FDR example is a good one because in '38 there was a real belt tightening that took place at Roosevelt's insistence, and it turned out to precipitate a major reversal. And so the administration, the president, are acutely aware that while they would like to get some kind of budget bargain, it shouldn't contract spending substantially in the short term. It shouldn't impose it shouldn't be getting a lot of new revenue, particularly from the middle, from middle and lower income Americans in the near term. And my concern is that this, if we think about the jobs picture, is that we have seen even before the downturn, we saw relatively slow job growth. We didn't see big middle income gains. I mean, I completely agree with Bev that things are going to be a lot better in 4 years than they were in 2008, and I really hope and expect that it'll be better than they are now. But it seems to me that probably more is going to be needed in the short to medium term to try to boost job growth, and it's not clear that there's neither an appetite in Washington nor a strategy on the part of the president to get that done. And so, there is some mobilization in the wake of the election to try to bring that issue to front and center. Labor groups, sort of the usual suspects, have said, look, let's do some serious infrastructure spending now. It seems to be the only thing that you might get business and labor to agree on. I think that there are some possibilities, but this is really an administration I think sees it itself as having two main priorities. One is getting some kind of deal here that leaves room open for some public investment, and two, consolidating on the big legislative achievements of the first 4 years. So making sure the Affordable Care Act is implemented, making sure that the Dodd-Frank financial reform legislation is implemented. So, it may be that the administration has to hope that there's sort of that momentum inherent in the trajectory of the economy, because as far as I can see it, there isn't a real strategy for medium or longer term growth that's being talked about right now.
And the debate in that respect, I mean, the entire campaign has been misleading, right? I mean, you had basically two guys fighting over who's better at creating jobs. Okay? None of them is good at it. That's actually not what the government does. I mean, in that respect, the critics are right. I mean, if Romney, for all his rhetoric about business and small business, whatever, I create jobs. I'm going to create 20 million jobs. It's about setting the conditions. And actually, I think Beth is exactly right. You're right also. I mean, a lot of the difficult decisions have been made, and job growth is slow. And you've done some great work about some of the structural reasons why potentially the recovery favors some more than others. But from a cyclical perspective, things are improving, and really, going back to your point, it's about not messing it up. Now, one way of messing it up is actually not getting a deal done in the short term, right? I mean, it is, up to 4% of GDP that we're talking about. There are a couple of other things that will be important in terms of energy costs, for example. I think that's an area where I think if an effort can be made to make sure energy costs remain relatively low, that's been supporting a sort of renaissance of manufacturing in part of the U.S. That's going to be important. So certainly things that can be done. Some people are talking about an additional package. I agree. I think that's relatively unlikely, even though a lot of economists are saying what we need is actually still some stimulus in the short term with a very credible commitment about consolidation in the medium to long term. The problem is, politics don't work that way. It's incredibly difficult to make that kind of a medium to long term commitment credible as far as financial markets are concerned.
So you remember at some point in the campaign, there was a lot of attention focused on the fact that no incumbent president had been reelected with unemployment as high as it was at the time. Barack Obama was reelected despite that. So does that suggest to you that the electorate really wasn't persuaded that, despite everything that both candidates were saying, that they were going to be able to make a big difference in the jobs picture?
Well, I think that was part of it, but I put my political science hat on for just a moment and say that, that meme that, that the unemployment rate or even the growth of GDP is sort of the most important determinant of the prospects for a president is just at odds with most of the research that suggests that that there is a wide range of outcomes possible at an unemployment rate of around 7 to 8%. So the president was at the upper end of the level where you would expect that he could get reelected, but he had incumbency advantage in his favor. He had the direction of the economy in his favor. There's mixed, but I think pretty good evidence that it's really the period just prior to the election that's crucial. And I think that then finally, so those two things matter a lot. Then finally, I would say that that the campaigns and the sort of choice that's presented to the electorate does matter. And what was really striking to me here was just how, despite all the talk about undecided voters and shifts in the final months, was just how stable the divide was and how much it came down to the president and his really impressive campaign team getting out people to vote. And probably, and this we'll see how long-lived this is, it did rest on a bit of a structural advantage that the Democrats seem to enjoy right now. We've historically talked about how the Republicans might enjoy a structural advantage in the Electoral College because Democrats kind of waste a lot of votes in urban areas and some of the some of the densely populated Democratic states. But this time around, there are estimates that the Republicans would have had to have a 2 percentage point national vote advantage to win the Electoral College, which is pretty remarkable. So there were scenarios under which the President Obama would lose the popular vote and win the Electoral College with a pretty good margin. And so that suggests that maybe we're seeing, with the consolidation of a very strongly Republican electorate on one side and a Democrat electorate on the other side, and the matching of it up with some of these states that have, that are very solid, very, very solidly Republican, that Republicans actually at the national level, at the Electoral College level, maybe have a little bit of a disadvantage. But my view is, coming back to it, that the economy was good enough that that incumbency advantage and the choice element of the election could become much more important. And with regard to the latter, I would just say, with regard to the choice, that the Republicans, Romney kind of moved back to the center right before the election, but the Republicans basically doubled down on a pretty conservative economic position, and coupled with an electorate that's changing, it just didn't resonate. It just didn't resonate. Obama did not have he pushed back hard against that. He was very hard on, he tried to shoot up the unfavorability ratings of Romney, but he did not have, I would say, some kind of like wham, bam, whiz, gee whiz kind of economic message out there. It was just that he was very clearly pushing back against what would be considered the more kind of conservative economic elements of the Republican agenda, and those elements did not do a very good job of getting people who were not already hardcore Republican supporters.
And the exit polls reflect that also, right? I mean, I think, for me, one of the main moments of the campaign was Bill Clinton's speech when he said, basically the message of the Republicans are, we messed it up. He hasn't fixed it in 4 years. It's time to put us back in. And I think the Obama team actually then ran with that. I mean, it provided a narrative for what they'd been saying before. And if you look at the exit polls, more people still faulted the Bush administration and their economic policy for the current crisis than the Obama administration. And that's something that I think is lost if you just look at the macroeconomic numbers or the labor market numbers.
Right, because there are some elections in which it really doesn't matter who the candidates are, right? It's very clear, doesn't really matter who the candidates are, and it doesn't really matter how well the campaigns are done, right? They're just going to go one way or another. And this absolutely was not one of those campaigns, right? I mean, this was a situation in which, despite structural advantages that are really pretty small if they exist at all, it was definitely an election to be won or to be lost. Mitt Romney was not, in the end, I think, a very good candidate. And one of the questions is, does then the analysis on the Republican side come out and emphasize the fact that Mitt Romney himself was just not a great candidate, right? The way we think about Bob Dole, I mean, Bob Dole wasn't going to win his election anyway, but I think people say, okay, well, he wasn't a great candidate, but there wasn't some sort of fundamental rethinking and sea change in the kinds of ideas that might be driving that. And I think the question is, even if we accept that Mitt Romney was not the world's greatest candidate, do we nonetheless need to rethink more fundamental things, or is that going to be where the analysis ends? And I think we don't really have a clear picture, and there's a real debate going on in the Republican Party around that very question. I will note that Mitt Romney's phone call recently, in which I think it was yesterday, in which he said that the reason that he had lost was that Obama had been handing out government favors to all of the people who voted for him. Gifts, exactly. Was quite astonishing, and my response to that was, wow, I can't believe you really were just such a bad candidate. That's just not going to get you very far. I mean, there is some truth in, I think, the insight that, in fact, often the way that people relate to government and shape their ideas about government is in fact by their tangible relationship with government, right? So in fact, if it turns out that the government helped you when you really needed a loan and you were able to go to college as a result, yes, that does in fact.
But
probably
because
change their
Republicans
ideas.
Republicans
That's
never
not
help their
something
constituencies,
insidious,
right?
That's just
I'm
that's
not, like,
the way
so
things work.
Politicians using government to
Exactly.
provide benefits to people whom they hope will vote for them. I'm
Scandalous,
shocked.
right?
Exactly.
Yeah,
This is
exactly.
taking place in Washington. But I actually think that I think there should be some serious soul searching, because it's true that Romney had deficiencies as a candidate, but I didn't see anyone certainly who decided to actually run,
Right.
who was a stronger general
Right.
election candidate than him. And if you will remember, just before the election, when either sincerely or strategically Republicans were expressing the belief that they were going to win this election, there were not a lot of questions. And there was actually, I mean, I would say that the most remarkable thing to me was that Republicans just prior to the election were willing to support Romney as he moved pretty dramatically toward the center. And I saw it as basically a very a savvy recognition that a losing candidate cannot do anything, and so if Romney has to moderate his positions in some areas, if that's what it takes to win, let's support him in doing that. But suddenly after the election, a lot of hardcore conservatives have suddenly said that Romney is the Michael Dukakis of the Republican Party, and that's just not true.
Right.
Except for the fact they were both Massachusetts governors. No, he was a candidate with flaws, but his favorability ratings on the eve of the election were actually not as bad as people think. They were up there and relatively close to the president. He made some really big missteps, which seemed completely sincerely to express, the old saying that a gaffe is when a candidate says the politician says what he really believes. The 47% statement, I think, was a really big deal, a really big misstep, because it expressed what core parts of the Republican Party thought about the relationship between government and certain parts of the population. And so that to me, it was not the messenger. It was the message. If it was anything about the campaign, it was really the weakness of the Republican get out the vote operation compared with the Democrats.
But what you said, I mean, in a way, the big Obama gaffe, right, was his Denver debate performance, and it was the same thing. I mean, it seemed to confirm what a lot of people feared, that he wasn't perhaps as passionate about the job anymore as he was, that he was disillusioned, that he actually didn't really have a plan, and there he shows up and it gives you the feeling he doesn't even want to be there. So, almost did him in, despite, many of the things that both of us discussed.
That's right.
Let me bring up healthcare, because that was something that might have changed significantly in a different direction if Mitt Romney had been elected president, right? I mean, that was one of his day one activities, was repealing the president's healthcare plan.
Do you think he would have done that?
Well, I think there would have been some major changes in the law. What repeal and replace meant sort of morphed over the course of the campaign. Romney at one point said, "My plan includes a protection for people with pre-existing conditions." One of his campaign staff later had to go to the reporters and said, "Well, when he said that, it's not really true."
If
you weren't short, right?
If you weren't short with pre-existing conditions, right?
I
Which is a qualification.
I haven't thought through exactly what the revisions would be, but let's be clear that that this was a close election, as Bev was saying, and a lot in policy terms hung on it. And the reason is that because even though it's hard to get things done in Washington, the big challenge is would have been getting over a Democratic filibuster. So let's say everything was the same, but Romney won. They would have done a little better in the Senate had Romney won, and the House. So they have a House majority. They might have a slightly they might be slightly closer to a Senate majority. Romney would have immediately gone to the reconciliation process, the budget process. He would have through that process probably extended all the Bush tax cuts. There was debate about exactly what his tax package would look like, but I think the immediate goal would have been to try to lock in those. And then he would have probably tried to strip out most of the subsidies in the healthcare law, some of the other requirements. The reconciliation process, the budget process, as we learned during the healthcare fight, doesn't allow you to do anything you want. There's rules about what's germane, but you can do almost anything that involves taxes and public programs and financing. And so core elements of the healthcare law, the Medicaid expansion, the subsidies for coverage, I think would have been in deep jeopardy. And so I think this really is a reminder of how consequential elections can be for policy. And I want to be clear that I don't think that for most people they understood that these issues hung in the balance. I mean, there's been some warming to the healthcare law among the public, but honestly, what we find is that these fights, which hinge on get out the vote operations, on sort of gauzy things about the candidates as a whole, maybe one or two big issues, determine in a very polarized environment a whole host of issues that depend on control of the levers of government in a political world in which honestly, it's so hard to get things done that once you get something in place, protecting it is really, you're in an advantaged position.
So what is left? What is the heavy lifting left for the Obama administration with respect to the health care bill?
Well,
Or
it's really getting the states to act. So there are two things. One is that the Supreme Court decision last year said that the Medicaid expansion, which is a big part of how coverage will be expanded under the law, was optional for the states. So the states, the administration was arguing that all of Medicaid funding should be contingent on whether they did this expansion. The expansion is, depending on where states are, is from where they are up to about 140% of the poverty level. And now the states have the option of not going ahead. But the fact is that the initial federal share of that expansion is like 100%, and then it declines a bit over time. So it's basically free money to the states to expand Medicaid. I'd be surprised, states would really have to be, their leadership would have to really be ideologically committed to not expanding Medicaid to give up that opportunity. With regard to the health insurance exchanges, which is the other major way that the law expands coverage, only a handful of states, I think 11 at last count, have indicated they're going to move ahead and create their own exchanges. Some other states have said, we know we're not going to do it. And some have said, we know we're going to do it in partnership with the federal government. We're on the eve of the state's determination of that. If the states do not, if they do not move ahead on their own, or they do not indicate to the federal government they're going to create their own exchanges, the federal government will create these exchanges, these marketplaces, online marketplaces for health insurance within those states. That's going to be the big challenge. And I get the sense, just listening to the rhetoric, that a fair number of state leaders, even though they were hoping and holding out until after the Supreme Court and then after the Romney decision, aren't really sure how to do it or what to do, and that's sort of troubling. And I think that a lot of states will end up having the federal government step in. Then the question becomes, well, how eagerly and aggressively and effectively will the federal government set up these exchanges? I mean, the argument for having the states do it, well, the real argument was that you couldn't get the Senate to, 60 members of the Senate to agree without it, but the real argument for having the states do it is that they have local knowledge and they have the capacities there. It's not a decision that can't be revisited, but so we're going to see it's going to be a messy scramble, and we're going to see a similar kind of mess around the Dodd-Frank law and its implementation, which is not to say, this is what governance is like. It's not to say that these are disasters or failures. It's to say that law is not self-executing, and the administration is going to spend a lot of time, and its allies are going to spend a lot of time next year fighting over achieving things that it had already quote-unquote won.
Yeah.
And I would also add that to the degree that we were saying this in the context of Romney's recent comment about people's relationship to government, and when government helps you, you vote for the people who might have helped you. I mean, one of the things that I think politically has been so difficult about this law is that it was passed, it was big, it was controversial, and then no one experienced it, right?
Yeah.
And so Obama has been saying all along, try it and you'll like it.
Right, exactly.
And so now that's actually what's going to happen. And a lot of it is going to its political consequences, I think, from here on out. Jacob is absolutely right that it's going to depend on implementation, and it's going to depend, its popularity as a law and a set of programs is going to depend on, how it is that people actually now experience it on the ground, which they really haven't been doing up to this point.
And the exact same thing, of course, is happening in parallel with the other big achievement that you talked about from the first term that is sort of unfinished, which is Dodd-Frank. the Wall Street Reform Act. I mean, it's about, I don't know what the final count was, 950 pages. You compare that, we've been talking about
You've read
FDR,
every page.
right? Every single one, that's right. It's been actually called the Consultants and Lawyers Full Employment Act in 2010. But jokes aside, I mean, the Securities and Exchange Act was about 25 or 30 pages. Glass-Steagall wasn't very long. This is a massive bill, and it's been criticized for being relatively vague. I mean, you now have, dozens of agencies, some of them who are already in existence, others who have been created, issuing thousands and thousands of pages of regulation that have to find their way through the financial system. So, policy is, you're saying, it's complicated, it's messy, it takes time, but it does in the end affect people's lives, and they'll see it, when they get their mortgage or refinance and so on. So there's going to be a lot of attention now on the implementation of those two, major achievements.
So what new issues do we think that the administration itself is likely to push hard on in a second term? And Beverly, actually, I'm curious to hear a little bit about how presidents use their second terms differently from the way they use their first terms when they are thinking very much about re-election.
Right. Right. Well, I think it's an open question about the Obama administration, because I think they haven't been signaling very strongly. And aside from the things that we've already talked about, right? I mean, a lot of the election, which is fairly typical this round, has been about things that won't happen, right, if I become president once again. So around things like what the Republicans might do around abortion, around kind of culturally conservative issues, right? I'm going to hold the line on this. And so is that action or inaction? I think we've seen some signals there. I mean, he's been talking a little bit about immigration reform, and that will be certainly one of the places where seeing what the Republicans are doing, seeing kind of how bipartisan that becomes will be very interesting. But I think the truth is that we actually don't know. We haven't seen a very kind of bold agenda aside from the kinds of things that we've been talking about. In terms of what it is that presidents often do, right, there are precedents for particularly Democratic presidents coming in with much larger, much more expansive agendas. Now, that can go a number of ways. I mean, Lyndon Johnson wasn't really quite being reelected in the sense that he hadn't actually been elected for that first term after Kennedy was killed. But so he came back into office with the War on Poverty, the Great Society, with this very broad ideological vision, which made a lot of changes, produced a lot of backlash. I mean, Franklin Roosevelt, when he came in 1937, this is the story of overreach of all overreaches, right? He attempts to pack the Supreme Court, and he runs into real stonewalling. But I don't think in this case we're going to see that kind of story. I mean, I don't think Obama's in any danger of overreach. If anything, he's kind of in danger of underreach and has long been in danger of underreach in many ways. But in Roosevelt's case, what actually happened in his second term was that his opposition really coalesced and began to stonewall in new ways. And that doesn't seem to be kind of the direction that things are heading here, though again, we'll see. So I think it is actually one of the great open questions. We're going to see some consolidation of what's already happened. We're going to see some not doing things that might happen under a Republican administration. But I mean, I don't think we've seen, now we're moving on to legislative triumph X, Y, and Z. It just hasn't been that clear.
I think immigration is the one area where I would expect, pretty bold initiative. And I think it's an area where will be, very difficult, at least for some parts of the Republican Party, not to move after what just happened in terms of the coalition. The other one I'd put out there, and I'm curious what your sense is, very mixed signals about the sort of intersection of energy and sustainability, right? So it was a big deal when Obama campaigned in 2008, climate change, renewable energy, energy independence. We get this natural gas boom all of a sudden, and some politics surrounding coal. All of a sudden, the debate has shifted and it is about energy independence, but the climate change part was entirely absent. I mean, Obama actually managed to spend, I think, 7 minutes talking in one of the debates about energy without ever mentioning climate change. Then he mentions it in his victory speech, and yesterday he downplayed it again in the press conference. So, that's an area where I think there is room for some bolder initiatives, but it's not clear exactly in what direction he might want to go.
Let me interrupt for a second because we've got a question from a viewer, and this is going to take us back to electioneering and electoral politics. Jared Gilbert tweets us to ask, to note that appeals to white evangelicals seem to have lost some of their potency in the electoral process. How will political relationship to faiths evolve in the next few years? Do we think that religion is going to be... Mitt Romney's Mormonism was not a big issue as was once thought to be. Is it going to be an issue in the future, religion?
Oh, it will certainly be an issue. I mean, it
Bold
doesn't.
prediction.
This is not disappearing from American politics. I mean, so evangelical Protestants, white evangelical Protestants, very strongly supported the Republican Party. This was not a case of a weakening of support, or even really of weakened turnout. It was of a much better turnout operation on the other side, and. There is certainly a story to be told about younger voters. They're more likely to be secular. Even when they have faith, they're less likely to be committed to more conservative elements of Protestant Christian conservatism. But I think there are two stories to tell here that are just worth mentioning. One is that that alliance of the kind of conservative economic philosophy of the Republican Party and Christian conservatism has been fraying for a while, in the sense that it's just not capable of producing large enough electoral majorities if you're getting substantial turnout across the population. It's also fraying. It also was fraying, I think, because the kind of conservative economic message came, at least up to this last electoral cycle, was coming to dominate. The Tea Party actually has a lot of Christian conservatives in it. And interestingly, that it really was dominated by commitment to sort of constitutional fidelity, which some people sort of see as having a biblical element to it, and conservative economic theory. But this time around, what was, I think, pretty clear is that when the Republican candidates, Romney probably was the least, was the least committed to this of some of the major leaders of the Republican Party who were in the spotlight. It was the Senate candidates really that brought this to the fore. When they tried to sort of go overtly appeal to the conservative religious base of the party, they ran into serious difficulties. So my sense is that this is still going to be a core element of the party. If you look at the platforms, the Republicans are very committed to conservative social issue positions, but that it is clearly not a winning electoral strategy, and in that respect there is a shift. So it's not a shift in terms of the ability of Republicans or even the eagerness of Republicans to appeal to conservative evangelical voters, but of the degree to which that allows them to engineer electoral victories. And so the question is, where do they clearly are alienating some a non-trivial share of the electorate with these appeals. So the question is, as before, Bev was asking this more about the general philosophy of the Republicans. Do they take this as a sign that there's a need for moderation, or are we going to see this continuing sort of tension between midterm and presidential elections, where with the lower turnout of midterms you can actually use these strategies, but it becomes the Achilles heel in a presidential election? I don't know, but to me it's a sort of explosive side of Republican politics, because it's both essential that they continue to activate this core part of the electorate, and it's costly for their long-term electoral success.
Let's turn to foreign policy. There's a lot going on in the world outside the United States, obviously, much of which the U.S. is involved in. We've still got a lot of troops in Afghanistan. China and the Middle East offer us something new and interesting every day. So I wonder what you think the most immediate and
Can I toss something in there? Because
Please.
we're again sort of narrowing the front.
Yeah.
So we're talking about a fiscal cliff. The entire European Union is going over a fiscal cliff right now. It is the biggest economic zone in the world, and it was entirely absent from the debate. The U.S. plays an incredibly important role at the IMF. Even the foreign policy debate has been focusing narrowly on a couple of places. we can start with those places, but let's also, remember the rest of the world that is looking to U.S. leadership on a whole range of issues.
Well, keep going.
Well, well, the Greek economy contracted 7% yesterday annually, right? I mean, this is, you're seeing the disintegration of, a project that has been going on over 2 generations, really, with U.S. support. But I think more importantly, it raises some important questions, again, about the sustainability of our model of balancing market economies with, somewhat comprehensive social protections. It raises questions about the role of financial markets in all of this and how they get regulated. The U.S. and the European Union have come up with somewhat different responses to, the 2008-2009 financial crisis. So, there are major challenges that not just affect the future of the global economy, but also some of the other debates about how we work our way back out of this financial crisis, and they were entirely missing from the campaign. I actually think, you were asking Beth before about how second terms are different from first terms. You think about Reagan, you think about Clinton, it's much more about foreign policy than the first term was. Bush, too, in that respect, was probably a little bit different because of 9/11 primarily. But I would hope that we'll see a lot of room for the president to actually lead in international issues, which include, of course, the Middle East.
Well, and just to second that, right, I think also the way in which Europe has been talked about in American politics up to this point really has been on the business pages, right? And the idea that somehow the European crisis is going to engulf the United States, or what is the United States going to do about it? But
and Romney's conclusion, we don't want to be Spain, right? I mean, that was sort of how it came into the debate at one point.
Well, you're seeing really, look at what happened in so many countries this week, right? You're seeing actually this growing level of social instability, social and political instability in Europe, which hasn't really kind of made its way onto the American agenda at all, but seems to be on the increase, and that maybe it's time for all of this to get off the business page and into the...
And as a result of the implementation of austerity policies that, you're talking about some of the people who've been shaping Republican economic policy, that's part of what they've been advocating to a certain extent, right? So there's a general debate of austerity, how to manage your debt, how to actually remain competitive without getting rid of social protections. We're going to have a big debate in the U.S. probably this period about entitlement reforms, and we've focused on the tax cuts and revenues. Republicans are going to look for some concessions when it comes to entitlements, and so those are some of the same issues that you see playing out in Europe right now, for example.
David, what are some steps that the United States government could realistically take to have a meaningful influence on circumstances in Europe?
Talk some sense into Angela Merkel at this point. I'm quite serious. I mean, I think the U.S.
The Chancellor of Germany. Yeah.
Sure, right. So that's right. Really, I mean, the U.S. actually, despite a lot of the rhetoric about austerity, there's actually been quite a bit, more fiscal expansiveness than what Germany has imposed on much of the southern European countries. Of course, there is a big moral hazard problem, and that is actually what is going on. But that perspective from the outside that the European Union is playing with fire, that Germany's insistence on austerity is putting the entire common currency at risk, and that is a global issue and not just an intra-European issue, I think is important. And Obama...
And by playing with fire, you mean the euro?
Yeah, I mean the euro. I mean, I mean the euro from an economic perspective. The euro is inseparable from the European political project. But then, of course, also, who else sort of, espouses this model of liberal economic policy, general emphasis on market system, but balancing it to a certain extent with some social protection. In that respect, Europe has been not too different from the U.S. compared to some of the other models that are now flourishing in some emerging markets, right? And there is a crisis of the legitimacy of that particular model that I think is not all too different from what will be discussed in the U.S. potentially.
Yeah, and I would say, just to add to that, is that there is that great old Benjamin Franklin quote that if we don't hang together, we're going to hang separately. And I do think that what we're seeing in the world economy right now is, the U.S. has done relatively better, and it's done relatively better in part because it did not pursue austerity policies. The perfect example of this comparison is looking at Britain and the United States, because their economic crisis was relatively similar. They have similar economies in many respects. Britain's economy is much more liberal than other parts of Europe in the classical conservative sense. But the Cameron government pursued an austerity policy that actually hasn't fully kicked in yet, and it just recently slipped back into recession. Its budget deficit has gone up, and it's given the Labour Party actually a real chance of recapturing the government. And if you look at across countries, the U.S. has done about as well as almost any country, and that's partly because of the much maligned stimulus package. But looking forward, and this is really, I think there's a Keynesian kind of dealing with a financial, there's a financial crisis. There's dealing with a financial crisis and a Keynesian response that, and how aggressively it was pursued. But then there's just this question of, what is the long-term growth trajectory of advanced industrial democracies, of rich societies, right? What's the future of the middle class?
The middle class is the key
in a world
issue,
economy.
in both places.
And we are hanging together on that question, for better or worse. And so if I think this is the sense in which there's far more similarity between the European model and the American model than there is between, say, the U.S. model and the Chinese model. And sort of really thinking through, how do you combine a basic level of economic security, investment in public goods, and innovation with competitiveness, with rising living standards. How do you deal with the rising inequality in the United States, which the U.S. is leading the world in this dimension, the rich world in this dimension, but other countries are following us, and those kind of questions were definitely not at the center of the presidential debate, although I think inequality really was a kind of beneath the surface, one of the fundamental issues. But they are the center of the question of what our society is going to look like a generation or two from now.
So let me press you guys a little bit on Afghanistan, just because it seemed to have been largely absent from as a major campaign issue. But if I'm not mistaken, there's something like 68,000 troops still there. It's not on the front pages of the newspapers very often lately. Do you think that the president, do you sense that the president has a real commitment to continuing to wind down there, and sort of how good a job does the United States appear to be doing in helping the Afghans create a government that can manage its own country?
Look, we should be in a very different position at this point. I mean, I don't know if that's politically correct to say. I mean, we're sort of trying to do, or the U.S. is trying to do, and its allies at NATO as best as they can. But the mere fact that, 11 years after the beginning of this, we're still talking about Taliban strongholds. We're still, concerned about whether the government there can sustain itself. Really does highlight that we're not trying to reach the lofty goal that was set out here. I mean, this is about a reasonably responsible drawdown and withdrawal, not completely unlike what happened in Iraq. The situation is going to be different from the way it was before the invasion, but it's a far cry from what the original goal was about what these countries should be looking like. I mean, nobody's even talking about sort of solid democratic representative institution there. It's really about putting the government in a position where they can provide some basic security and they can continue the struggle against extremism. So, I think the administration can't back down from their withdrawal plans. That would be untenable, and it's just about managing that withdrawal in the most responsible way. But Afghanistan is facing tremendous challenges, just like many other countries, and that are affected by extremism. And really, I think the West hasn't come up with, a sensible solution for those challenges for those countries. Sort of tried it our way, made it a little bit better, didn't really succeed in every respect. Back to you.
And I was just going to say, and I do think you see a real retreat on the part of the Obama administration. I mean, a real appetite in the country not to be putting troops anywhere, right? I mean, having failed to some degree, right? I mean, having really not accomplished what was supposed to be accomplished, if it was ever accomplishable, which I don't necessarily agree
Fair
that it
point.
ever was
That's right.
possible from the beginning. But nonetheless, you also see, I think, a very disturbing turn, and one that, when it came up in the debates, all you got was sort of agreement between the two parties, and this is one of the reasons that foreign policy didn't play such a big role in the debates, because it really wasn't a point of very significant division between the two candidates, but a turn to much more secretive, intelligence-based strategies, the widespread use of drones, and these sorts of things that are going on really in increasing numbers by our constitutional scholar president.
Yeah.
And I think ultimately these are going to be one of the great legacies of the Obama administration, but really aren't on the front page yet in ways that they may ultimately be, but in ways that I think deserve more attention.
We've got just about 5 minutes left. I want to return to a question about domestic politics. This is about the Electoral College. We talked earlier in the discussion about the fact that this was a close election, certainly in the popular vote. The Electoral College was not close. It was. I don't know if it's fair to call it a blowout or not. You tell me. But it was a decisive victory for the president in the Electoral College. Like it, don't like it. Will it ever change?
All right. Well, those are different questions.
I'd say
Right.
hate it.
On a scale of 1 to
Yeah. Oh, I don't know, but I mean, so here, let's count the things that are wrong with the Electoral College. One is it's malapportioned. I mean, it's not as badly malapportioned as the Senate, but it reflects Senate malapportionment. So you get the number of Electoral College votes as you have a sum of districts and Senate seats, and so that gives these very sparsely populated states a little extra edge, but that's not the biggest aspect of it. I think the other big thing is that I supremely dislike about it is the concentration of all electioneering in the battleground states. The fact that you get this winner-take-all dynamic, which means that your goal is really to try to get, just as the president did, just over the 50% threshold, and everything else is basically wasted. And then I would just say, there is a real issue of legitimacy in those cases, and they do occur when the Electoral College vote and the popular vote go different directions. I was secretly wishing, just sort of in the back of my mind, but I'm not sure, I think it would have been a bad outcome on multiple dimensions, that Republicans have won the popular vote and lost the Electoral College vote, only because perhaps, just perhaps, you might get a little bit more interest in Electoral College reform. I don't see it. So the first question is, do I like it? No. The second is, do I see much of a prospect of changing it? No. If 2000 didn't create enough pressure to do it, then I'm doubtful that there's anything foreseeable that will. I think the best hope is that you move for a variety of ways. You move towards allocation of Electoral College votes by the states proportional to the vote totals within those states. It could only be done. Akhil Amar at the law school has 3 ways it could be done, but I only foresee it being done basically through some kind of multi-state compact, and that's the best we could hope for, and that would be pretty good.
I agree. Not a fan. Don't like the Electoral College. But just to add one reason to Jacob's reasons, it's not just that it means presidential candidates say don't come campaign in a state like Connecticut. It actually
really
has
miss
this
them.
really, right. That might be a fine thing. But it really profoundly affects the way that people behave politically, right? So not just that you have to go to a swing state to do anything meaningful, but the ways in which it suppresses, right, anyone's ability to sort of be activist-oriented in their hometown, to make political connections with their neighbors, to have it really matter whether Obama won Connecticut by 3 million votes. I don't know how many people quite live in Connecticut. We'll make our lowers.
3.5
million votes or 100,000 votes. If that mattered, that would actually be transformative, and not just at the level of where television ads are being placed, but at the level of how people behave politically. But I agree, it's nobody has enough of a concerted interest in better democracy, right? Nobody, I think, at this point sees a very clear partisan interest in changing that, and outside of that, it's often hard to make really big changes.
David?
No, I completely agree. It does make it fun for political junkies to think about campaigns, and you start talking about all of this. But I don't think it's going to change. People, of course, will say that one of the benefits is that states that wouldn't get a lot of attention, like the Iowas and New Hampshire and so on, get a lot of attention. But yes, from an equity perspective, why should they get more attention in California or New York or Texas, right? So You know, as from a foreign perspective, you look at this and you're like, oh my God, you know, this system makes no sense. But think when it was built. I mean, it was built in the late 18th century. It's worked pretty well. I mean, in the sense of providing, you know, stable democratic government over a very, very long period of time. And you know, so it'll probably be, you know, with us way past, you know, our lifetime, would be my guess.
And if I can add one quick thing, this was a close election. So our fact that we say, well, was it a blowout, right? This sort of little more than 2% in the popular vote, and a little over about 130 votes in the Electoral College. That is still closer, even in the Electoral College, than all but 5 elections in the entire course of the 20th century between 1900 to 1999. And the fact that we actually understand this election to have been so decisive and to have been a blowout sort of indicates what a sort of strange historical period we're actually living through, where we've become so used to close elections that, man, you know, as long as the Electoral College vote and the popular vote match up, we're good to go.
Right.
And it's decisive.
Yep.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, David, Beverly, and Jacob. I hope you'll come back and join us again sometime. And thanks to all of you for watching at Yale Live. We'll see you next time.